Airports are the 21st century crossroads. More than 8 million people travel by air every day, over 3 billion every year. We live in a time when air travel is available to almost everyone on the planet. Travel on this scale happened because of one thing: the jet airplane. Jets take off every second of every day. Some have 2 engines, some have 4. They come from Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, Bombardier, and others. But large or small, no matter the airline, almost all share a shape: the wing. How this modern jetliner came to be is the story of 3 Boeing jets and secrets discovered in a German forest at the close of World War II. World War II in Europe pitted one country, Germany, against the armed forces of more than a dozen countries. But the German military victorious. In secret, for over a decade, the Nazis had been developing what they called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons.
The Germans had been investing huge amounts of money, time, and effort in the notion of super weapons, including the most advanced airplanes, designs, and research.
The Germans had built the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. It marked the beginning of a revolution in high-speed flight.
The advent of the jet engine allowed much higher thrust from the engines, which then would allow higher speeds.
The Me-262 was the fastest plane in the sky, but the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been working on even more advanced designs.
At the tail end of the war, the Allies began to report, particularly from Germany, sightings of these strangely shaped German aircraft with swept wings.
Aircraft with wings that swept back from the body of the plane like an arrow. Every airplane since the Wright brothers had featured straight wings positioned perpendicular to the body of the aircraft.
At the end of the war, the Allies sent Boeing guys, and other folks too, in to find out what in the world was happening.
With the Nazi regime facing defeat,
thought it was too nice, so he didn't blow it up. He took these guys down into the vault where all the data was.
Inside of it was incredible troves of information about flight that no one in America had been able to achieve. They had laboratories, they had jet fuel facilities, they had 7 wind tunnels, and they had work going on with a swept wing.
It was the swept wing that immediately captured the Americans' attention. The swept wing design suggested that the Germans had solved a problem that had stymied the British and the Americans, who had both built jet engines, but no planes that could take advantage of them.
The International Conference in Aeronautics, the so-called Volta Conference, when they met Busemann, he reminded them that he had given this paper on swept wings that they had all forgotten about.
Many of the world's important aerodynamicists had attended the conference, including von Karman himself.
Very few people at the meeting paid attention to it. However, the Germans paid attention to it, and within a year, they classified the concept of the swept wing and initiated a great deal of laboratory wind tunnel research on swept wings.
George Schirra immediately recognized the significance of the research at Wolkenrode.
He wrote a letter home telling the fellows, you better get in the wind tunnel and see what this is all about, because this is a way to fly airplanes fast.
Boeing was in a competition with 3 other companies to produce the next generation American bomber, a jet. It would be called the B-47. For nearly 2 years, Boeing had been working on a design with straight wings.
George Schirra made the very gutsy call to immediately
damage the airplane.
The Boeing designers had painful memories of the engine fires that had plagued the development of the B-29 bomber.
So they came up with this wild notion, which is really wild, of hanging the engines under the wings.
The radical new design would suspend the engines on struts, hanging below the wing in small pods.
Mounting them on pods needed a lot of detailed design work in the wind tunnel to get it just right. And it had to be just right. If you're a few % out, you were in considerable trouble.
One of the most feared words in the development of aircraft is something called flutter, where a wing develops a curious kind of vibration. The guys testing the mock-up in the wind tunnel, they're trying to see whether the plane is stable, and bits would blow off, bits would break off. It was an impossible task because the wing really moved around like jello. They went through this process of having to tame the plane.
A process of trial and error revealed that the weight of the engines themselves, placed at critical points below the wing, brought the flutter under control.
They proved this crucial thing. This is a really transforming wing. This wing doubled the speed at which we could fly. And this was done by just a handful of people in that wind tunnel.
So by 1947, they were developing the world's first swept wing large aircraft, the first B-47.
And when they demonstrate the B-47 for the first time to the Air Force sent a fighter up to chase it, but it was an old generation fighter, and they lost the bomber. They couldn't find it. The bomber was faster than the fighter. That had never happened before.
Boeing got the contract to build a fleet of B-47s. But the B-47 was a military plane, not a passenger jet. The idea of a jet aircraft carrying passengers higher, faster, and farther, and in ever greater comfort, required a leap of imagination as well as technology. Bill Allen, who became Boeing's president at the end of World War II, did not fit the description of a visionary.
On the surface, he looks like a very ordinary, unremarkable accountant, lawyer, a boring kind of person. But every company that's going to be successful needs a man like Bill Allen.
Bill Allen had spent years serving as Boeing's corporate lawyer. He became the president of Boeing just as the government was canceling $1.5 billion in contracts with the company. The B-47 bomber was an exception. It was a plane that was taking the Air Force into the jet age. Bill Allen wanted it to do even more. Allen had been listening to George Schirra and his team sing the praises of the swept-wing B-47. The jet was quieter, smoother, and much faster than any prop plane. So in the summer of 1950, Bill Allen decided to try it out for himself.
He climbed up into the belly of the beast and sat behind the pilot.
The B-47 lifted Bill Allen to an altitude thousands of feet higher than passenger planes typically traveled. And it reached speeds nearly 2 times faster, more than 600 miles an hour.
He had the jet experience for the first time. It was very quiet up there, and it was really transforming for him.
Bill Allen taking a ride in a B-47, seeing is believing. This is where passengers want to be. And if I want to be here, passengers want to be here.
But convincing airlines to believe that passenger jets were the future was another matter. They would not be eager to abandon their fleets of propeller-driven planes. And passengers, too, were wary of jets.
Jet travel. People really wondered whether that was just too fast for a human being to go.
People feared traveling on planes that were using a technology that was relatively new and relatively untested. And of course, the crash of the British comets further exacerbated people's fears of flying aboard jets.
The British were actually the first to embrace the idea of a passenger jet. In 1952, they introduced a 40-seat plane called the de Havilland Comet. It was a beautiful design to look at, but the Comet was doomed.
It was an exquisitely beautiful machine, very sleek, a beauty to behold. But unknown to them and unknown to the aviation business at the time, there was a flaw in the way the fuselage was constructed.
Soon after the Comet entered service, it suffered a series of mysterious and catastrophic failures.
3 comets crashed. And that was not actually due to the fact that they were jets.
It was because the Comet had square windows and not round ones. In the corner of the window, metal fatigue developed. And when the plane reached a certain altitude, it suffered a...
To the next step, building a prototype.
But the financial risk of designing just a one-off prototype were enormous. Manufacturers were used to having airlines order 30, 40, 50 aeroplanes, underwriting the cost of building the prototypes. Not only were they building an aeroplane, they were building a brand new type of aeroplane. So it was a colossal risk.
We invest a gamble in the history of aviation. He was determined to take Boeing and commercial aviation into the jet age with a plane that would become the Boeing 707.
The prototype 707 was one of the most extraordinary airplanes, not just in the history of the Boeing company, but in the history of American commercial aviation.
In May 1954, the shiny, sleek 707 prototype was wheeled out of the Boeing plant just south of Seattle, Washington. The wife of the company's founder, Bill Boeing, christened it the airplane of tomorrow. But the reality that day was that no airline had yet embraced the 707 as the future of passenger travel. Now it was the future of the Boeing company itself that was at stake. One year after its rollout, the 707 looked like a loser. No airline had stepped forward to buy the plane that Bill Allen believed.
Supposed to take off, fly over the races, turn around and fly back to show the airplane off to the potential customers down at the race.
He hadn't given Tex Johnson any instructions about what is very sexy, made a roar. But Tex Johnson has an idea of his own.
There were probably 350, 400,000 people gathered, in or around the lake. The airplane all of a sudden started to turn, and it almost looked like the plane might be out of control.
He's over this crowd and he decides to do a barrel roll.
Okay, we're looking good.
And Alan's heart literally stops. He calls for pills from a guy alongside him. He thinks, what on earth does Tex think he's doing?
Tex, damned if he didn't come back and roll it again over the course. And I think that was when it was generally conceded that Bill Allen about had a fit.
If this thing goes out of control and crashes, it could kill thousands of people. But even if it crashed elsewhere and didn't kill a single soul, it was still going to kill the company.
As that William Allen essentially said, what do you think you're doing? Our company depends on an airplane that you just rolled. Johnson looked at him and said, well, you wanted me to sell airplanes.
The demonstration was spectacular. But airline executives still felt the leap to jets was too risky. Everyone except for Pan Am's Juan Trippe. The legendary founder of Pan American World Airways started his airline with a mail route between Florida and Cuba in 1927. A decade later, his flying boats, called Pan Am Clippers, were island hopping their way across the Pacific. He expanded Pan American into the first worldwide airline.
Trippe was the man who saw the world airline map first and what you had to do to fulfill the promise of aviation. He was a titan of the airline business. He bestrode the business as a visionary maniac.
The success of Pan Am was based upon Juan Trippe the gambler. He made the most colossal gambles anybody has ever made, and he made them over and over again.
Trippe placed an order for 20 707s, but he insisted that nobody know about it. In true Trippe fashion, he wanted to enter the jet age with the greatest possible fanfare. In October 1955, there was an international aviation conference in New York. All the major airline leaders were in attendance.
And afterwards, they all came to Trippe's house. And he lets it slip that tomorrow in the paper you'll read that I've entered the jet age. They were frantic. They didn't know what to do. Every airline in the room rushed out to order the new planes. It upset the aviation world terrifically. My God, the cost to everybody was astronomical, and he forced it on them because he was first and he had enough nerve to go forward.
Rival airlines now had no choice. Enter the jet age or be left behind.
Welcome aboard the spacious cabin, attractively decorated, air-conditioned, but dry.
We would have a caviar and champagne service, and we'd have roast beef and 2 or 3 entrees to choose from. And all through, we'd be serving really, really, really good wine.
To travel on a 707, you became what was then known as the jet set, and it was the thing to do. It was popular. The Beatles travelled on 707s. The Rolling Stones travelled on 707s. And so everybody wanted to travel on 707s.
Sinatra would sing, "Come fly with me," and it created an aura, a mystery, a magic. The jet age is a very early example of brilliant marketing. It was a great piece of show business.
For the airlines and for Boeing, Bill Allen's gamble paid off.
Within a year, movement patterns over the North Atlantic had changed completely. You now had more people crossing the Atlantic by air than by sea, overturning a millennia's worth of ocean-going voyages.
Something new in the human experience had to happen. The utility of jet travel would enable the whole world to suddenly take wing.
Juan Trippe boasted, with characteristic grandiosity, "In one fell swoop, we have shrunken the earth." But Juan Trippe and Bill Allen were not done. Higher, faster, farther. Those 3 words have always been what drove the progress of aviation. In 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. And by the 1960s, military planes were routinely traveling at supersonic speeds. But a supersonic transport, an SST, that could carry passengers across oceans and continents in only a few hours, nothing like that was yet in the skies.
In the early 60s, the British and the French took an early initiative, and they went ahead and contracted to build the Concorde.
Concorde would be the first supersonic passenger jet.
The Kennedy administration debated, should the U.S. develop its own SST, one larger and faster and one that would trump the Concorde.
But President Kennedy had already committed the country to the most ambitious, expensive, and technologically challenging project in history, the mission to send men to the moon. He was slow to commit to the SST. But Pan American's Juan Trippe was convinced it was time for commercial jets to take the next step into the future.
Trippe was truly a visionary. He viewed supersonic flight just as he had viewed all the previous frontiers. It was the last frontier before space flight.
So Trippe set out to manipulate the President of the United States.
Juan Trippe is a very conspiratorial control freak, not a nice person, and one of his geniuses was realizing how he can manipulate everyone into giving Pan Am what Pan Am wants.
Trippe went to the competition. He made a deal to buy 6 supersonic Concordes from the French and the British for tens of millions of dollars. He then strategically leaked the news to the American press. President Kennedy was not pleased.
You can tell him I'm going to spend the next time I'm here really giving a screwing to Pan American, because that sticks it right to us.
This is the president on the phone with the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration.
Well, now, will you give him and make it very clear that I think he ought to retract that, and he ought to wait now and see what the United States is going to do. We'll give him all the trouble he wants, because there isn't going to be anything that's going to make me more excited than doing that.
As often happened, Juan Trippe got his way.
I'm announcing today that the United States will commit itself to an important new program in civilian aviation.
The very next day, Kennedy announced his support of a plan to build an American supersonic transport.
And in supersonic flight, challenging new frontier.
Trippe at his best. A lovable man, but my God, he was good.
Boeing, Lockheed, and North American competed to get the government contract to build the SST.
Boeing won with a revolutionary design, the most amazing aeroplane.
Scale mock-up on display in Seattle became a destination for people in the aviation business.
Swing wing, 4 huge engines, 300 passengers, 2.5 times the speed of sound.
It was a plane that broke with the design of all previous commercial jets. But even its most ardent supporters conceded that a plane that pushed the absolute limits of technology was likely to take a decade or more to enter service. And Juan Trippe was impatient. He didn't